Thanks, Anthony, and obviously welcome to everybody for joining us. And it's a real great pleasure to be joined by Michael today. And in preparation for this talk, I was kind of almost taken back to my grad school days, and I actually pinpoint a particular kind of 3 months from December to March 2003, where December to March in year 2000. And two books kind of arrived to me in the very same moment, and that was Michael and Tony's book Empire and Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. And so I guess, Michael, both you and Deleuze arrived into my life in the very same moment. And I would also kind of say that actually both books completely upended my thought processes in a very positive and in very engaging way. So I owe you a considerable debt for that. But I want to kind of put that kind of maybe back to you as a question and kind of ask you, how did you feel, obviously knowing how much Deleuze has kind of influenced your work historically and how much you've obviously been taken by Deleuze, how did you feel when you first encountered A Thousand Plateaus, and what did that book kind of mean to you personally once you received it?
I came to Deleuze by a strange route or circuitous route, I guess. I was in graduate school in the middle 1980s. I was frustrated by my own political engagements, and so I came to him through a political route, actually. Which I was frustrated with political engagements in the U.S. and Central America, and it was at that point that reading about what happened in Italy in the 1970s inspired me and was very exciting. And so it was really the first encounter, not yet Deleuze, was through the book that Tony Negri and Deleuze Guattari wrote together. It had come out right around then, which was first called Communists Like Us, and the New Spaces of Freedom. I think it's now been reissued as. And so it was via that then I was interested, I had known the Italian thing, so I was in, like, who is this Guattari guy? And so it was via that then I read A Thousand Plateaus and entered the Deleuze universe, not via the philosophical route, which certainly then did interest me a lot, but for its political engagements, which is what, to just now maybe to answer your question properly, it was the political frameworks that I found in the book that most excited me at that encounter, and I think I still read the book through the lens of its political problematics, something like that.
Yeah, I guess it's really interesting you say, Michael, because the one thing which I took from, and I think what I was very appreciative of your book, and also I think the ways in which actually you went beyond A Thousand Plateaus as well, and I think we can come on to that in a moment. But what I really particularly appreciated about your work was how you put Deleuze's ideas to work politically. And it wasn't then just read, and that's what I get the sense from A Thousand Plateaus, that it is a profoundly political book. It's not just a book of philosophy. And is that how you kind of thought that was the best way to actually engage the book as well, as a book of even perhaps more political than actually it is philosophical?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's the right way to do it or the best way to do it. It was what satisfied a need for me. And, and also now, as I'm, with a different perspective on things, that's in some ways the way I read Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, even in relationship to each other. Anti-Oedipus was a great commercial success, published in 1972, and was partly hailed as a kind of summation and engagement with the thought of 68 and the notion of revolution, even the notion of lines of flight as revolutionary, etc. And so I would say, insofar as Anti-Oedipus is a book about 1968, A Thousand Plateaus is really a book about the revolutionary movements of the 1970s. And so it's published in 1980, as you said before, and I think it struggles with, and both interpreting and, let's say, working through the problems of the revolutionary movements of the 1970s, which are much more complex, much more troubling. The question about violence, like I'm sure you're sensitive to, is very present in the book, as it was in the movements. So I think, in fact, it's maybe because I find the revolutionary movements of the 1970s more interesting and more useful that I find Anti-Oedipus more. That I find A Thousand Plateaus more useful for me and for us now than I do Anti-Oedipus, which is, like I said, I do think it's a gathering of some of the enthusiasm of 1968, and yeah, and I don't mean to belittle it or something, but I do think it's of a different era, and that's the way I approach the books now, at least.
Well, in terms of that, then, that situatedness that you're talking about, Michael, and the kind of complexities that you're talking about as well is, are you also then kind of seeing the book as also a way of tarrying with the reactionary conservatism of the 70s as well? So that's the book has to really deal with the responsive state violence to what happens in the late 60s and clamping down on that. Is that what makes the book perhaps more complex and perhaps more urgent in some respects as well?
Right. No, I think that's definitely right. I mean, it's the 70s, the revolutionary movements of the 70s faced situations of extreme repression and violence, and I wouldn't call the repression so much in response to the 60s, but as a threat to the movements and ways that the revolutionary movements something they had to react to. And so it's full of danger. That's one of the things that one notices reading A Thousand Plateaus is the need for caution, dangerous terrain. Political solutions are never simple. Whereas it could seem, reading the earlier book, that lines of flight were liberatory in themselves. By the time we get through the 1970s, it's always many-sided and troubling and ambiguous, which I actually think politically is actually much more useful, but doesn't provide the same kind of simple answers or simple perspective on things.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the things we briefly mentioned before the start of this was of all the books that we've actually dealt with in this series, I think in A Thousand Plateaus actually the reference to actual violence is more prescient than actually in perhaps even Fanon or even certainly in Arendt's work, and I'm just wondering then in terms of that kind of they say the danger signs, what they're talking about in the book is a very clear reaction to the actual reality of violence that's dominating the 70s, and which we know, of course, has carried through in terms of, post-70s moment, which the ways in which state violence, but also violence beyond the state takes on new and more kind of catastrophic forms in many ways.
Right. No, that's probably right. One thing, one caution I have, because I've been fascinated with the revolutionary movements of the 70s recently, a caution I have about it is that there's a tendency for the movements of clandestine armed struggle, Red Army faction in Germany and Japan, or Red Brigades in Italy, to eclipse all the other revolutionary movements that were going on, which I think, in my view, are much more productive politically and much more interesting. But it's not. So there's a kind of, I think sometimes we have to get, that's the first image I think that often comes to mind for people of if one says violence in the 1970s. But other movements were able to wield either violence or the use of force or the use of arms in different ways, which were much more productive. So anyway, I'm somewhat cautious about the ways that the notions of clandestine armed struggle get, because so spectacular, perhaps, seem to overshadow many of the other uses of force. It reminds me of something I remember there was a review that Deleuze Guattari wrote in the end of the 70s sometime, and it was in response to a German film that had been made by different German directors about the Red Army faction. And Guattari said, and I think this is very consistent within A Thousand Plateaus, is that there's nothing to say for or against armed struggle. Armed struggle is necessary in revolutionary instances, etc. One has to look, though, at the use of violence in the context of the movements and what effects it has on them. So it's not, the choice isn't violence or nonviolence. It's the question is about how that the use of force, the use of violence in its different forms fits within within a larger movement. So that seems to me, I mean, that's part of what I guess what both of us are saying about the complexity of it. It's not, it would be a simple answer if one could just say, the road to freedom is the refusal of violence. That is just not true. You know, that and so one has to make distinctions, and that's when it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, I'm kind of taken by that kind of that history you talk about, and I'm kind of as you was talking, I was thinking about then the ways in which those complex lines between violence, non-violence, kind of take on a new form by the 1980s, and I'm thinking about the genealogy for the Zapatista movement, which many people trace back to 1984, and even the Zapatistas themselves, they are kind of emerging in this moment when this book kind of arrives as well. And I think there is there is that sense in which there is that kind of ongoing tension between to what extent is violence necessary, but how does that take on new forms which can actually end up in non-violent strategies as well.
Right, that's true too.
Yeah. So in terms of the actual book, Michael, is there a particular passage that stands out for you and one that you always kind of return back to as saying this is the passage that really captures the book for you?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but in fact, what I thought would be helpful for me is to start with just not even a full sentence from difference in repetition, because so one of the concepts that's certainly key in A Thousand Plateaus is multiplicity, and they give a lot of different meanings to it. But and like I said, I think that this is even the way that they explore the concept of multiplicity. I take now, of course, there are many different ways of. I don't mean to reduce it only to this. One could think about multiplicity in mathematics, which fascinated Deleuze, etc. But I'm thinking of it in terms of political organizing, in which that was, in fact, one of the mandates, I think, of the most interesting revolutionary movements of the 70s, is how to organize in terms of multiplicity. And this is so when I read Deleuze, now I'm going to read a partial sentence from Difference and Repetition. Difference and Repetition was published in 1968, so it's earlier, but still Deleuze is working through the concept. And it's useful for me. He says here, multiplicity must not designate a combination of the many and the one. So he's contrasting it to the notion of the dialectic that can put together the one and the many, but rather multiplicity must designate an organization belonging to the many as such, which has no need whatsoever of unity in order to form a system. Like that's what I think the interpretation, I think, of the political movements that we find in A Thousand Plateaus is about the possibility of a multiplicity that is not anarchic. It cannot be reduced to a unity. It cannot be directed by a vanguard or centralized leadership whatsoever. But nonetheless, it has no need for unity in order to form a system. That's what and that seems to me really, I have found that really exciting. So let me then try, because A Thousand Plateaus sometimes needs a little bit of introduction to get, what they're talking about, because it can be kind of crazy. So let me try then a passage here that then I think takes up on that. I'm in the second chapter. It's called One or Several Wolves. It is about packs, multiplicities, etc. But here's the passage. I'm on page 32, if anyone's reading along at home, at the bottom of the page. They say, let us return to the story of multiplicity. For the creation of this substantive, a multiplicity, multiplicity as a noun, the creation of this substantive marks a very important moment. It was created precisely in order to escape the abstract opposition between the multiple and the one, again, the opposition to the dialectic, to escape dialectics, okay, to succeed in conceiving the multiple in a pure state, to create, to cease treating it as a numerical fragment of a lost unity or totality, or as the organic element of, or as the, or as the, organic element of a unity or totality yet to come, and instead distinguish between different types of multiplicity. I'm sorry, I read that badly, but in essence, I mean, so part of it is again what pursuing what Deleuze had said in the passage I read in Difference and Repetition, that one job of the one importance of the multiplicity, of notion of multiplicity, is to be able to understand a coherent, he says, that can form a system without need of being reduced to one. But the other thing that they're adding here at the very end, and so I should just say it again since I read it so badly, is that what we need to do instead is to distinguish between different types of multiplicity. Like that is a big project in 1,000 Plateaus, to distinguish among different types of multiplicity. So it's not just multiplicity good, unity bad. There are different types of multiplicity that, and part of the ethical or political, really, judgment is about distinguishing among them. Yeah, so for instance, we could come to violence with this too, but many people responding to Deleuze and Guattari have been frustrated, I think. Like, I think of Slavoj Žižek had this response at one point where he said, look, they're talking about all these multiplicities. It turns out that capital too functions by multiplicities and things. And I think that Deleuze and Guattari are saying here, yes, of course, the enemy also functions by multiplicities. And so it's not that we can just say multiplicity, we're done, that's it. It's instead one has to then distinguish among them. Like, that's the ground for for starting the process of political decision making. That's, I guess, where I would put it. So they are, like I said, they are part of the moment of the refusal of the vanguard party, the refusal of centralized leadership in politics, etc. But that doesn't mean it's without some coherence or system. Multiplicity doesn't mean anarchy in the sense of no order or something like that. But it also doesn't mean that any multiplicity is good. That's what. So that distinguishing among them goes for quite a long ways, I think, in the posing the project of the book.
Yeah, no, I find that really fascinating because as you say, that there's this tendency on the one hand to, I think first of all, the point you mentioned about breaking from the dialectic, I think seems to be a real revolutionary shift, actually. And I know you write about this in the apprenticeship for the Deleuze book on the apprenticeship in philosophy, and how there's that kind of shift from the Hegelian to the Nietzschean kind of politics, which I think is very important. But the point about this multiplicity, I think, once we, as you say, I think it's almost easy if we kind of situate multiplicity versus the state, because then it becomes kind of an easy kind of dialectic, right? And once again, we fall back into that trap of the unity of the opposition and the unity of the state or whatever else. And it seems to me that one of the most prescient challenges of our times is precisely, okay, how can we navigate a world where everybody is talking about respect for difference now? And this kind of, and the one thing the right has done remarkably well is mobilizing an effective politics of identity in a way in which they say they're the voice of differences and they're the voice of, and I think that point that you're then making, to me, would make this text altogether more relevant in terms of if we're thinking about what is the ethical distinction between different competing conceptions of difference. And I guess the question is, how do we decide between the fascist versus the non-fascist? Seems to be perhaps the question there, no?
Absolutely, right. And that is part of their analysis of fascism in this book, is that it is mobile, it is a micropolitics. It doesn't fit neatly onto the, like you were saying, the state, non-state binary. So that's certainly true. There's one other passage I would like to look at, if that's okay, which is toward the end of the book. And yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be too Tony, my co-author, hates it when I do this. I don't mean to like reduce all of our thoughts to just like as if we, derived it all from here. But it's certainly true that our thinking of the concept of multitude certainly related to the notion of multiplicity worked out in this book. And then the passage I wanted to point to now definitely helped us think about the notion of empire. We posed the terms for it. I mean, it's also not coincidental, because like I'd said, not many years earlier, after 1,000 Plateaus was published, but before Tony and I started working together, he wrote this book with Guattari. So they were working with this notion of integrated world capitalism, which was pointing in this direction in some sense. But the reason that reminded me of this passage is when you were saying that the political question doesn't map conveniently onto the state, non-state, division, and that's certainly what's going on here. So to give you, it's on page 421, the bottom half of the page, and the context in part is their reversal of Clausewitz's famous formula, something that Foucault was also working with in these years, which is to say, the famous formula of Clausewitz is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And so they reverse it to think that politics is the continuation of war by other means. That's what they're working with. But and so this is where Deleuze and Guattari go with it. Maybe I can go until there. Okay, so they say, and so I guess I should also start with this, which they've been talking about in this section, is that the state, they've set up these notions about the state and the war machine. It's probably better if I don't get too deep into what the war machine is at this point. It's one of those complicated things, but they do say, that it often functions that states appropriate a war machine, and put it at their service, but that this is the reversal of it that they're talking about here. So they say we could say that the appropriation has changed direction, or rather that the states tend to reconstitute an immense war machine of which they're no longer anything more than the opposable or opposed parts. This worldwide war machine, which in a way reissues from the states, displays two successive features. First, that of fascism, which makes war an unlimited movement with no other aim than itself. But fascism is only a rough sketch. And the second, post-fascist figure is that of a war machine that takes peace as its object directly, as the peace of terror or survival. The war machine reforms a smooth space that now claims to surround the entire earth. Total war itself is surpassed toward a form of peace more terrifying still. The war machine has taken charge of the aim worldwide order, and the states are now no more than objects or means adapted to that machine. So, I mean, what Tony and I took them to be thinking, the direction we took from it is thinking about the incipient formation of a global order in which the states are still important parts, but that one should not think of states as sovereign actors, but rather as actors within a larger framework. So that's part of it. But the other part of it here is this notion about peace and war. That was the part that I thought would appeal to you. In the sense that this peace that this global, what they're calling here worldwide war machine, or a new global power structure proposes a peace, but a form of peace that's actually much more terrifying, and actually perhaps much more violent. Maybe that's another way of saying it. That extends, it says here in that passage that I read that the states are. They tend to unleash this, but the states are no longer anything more than the opposable or opposed parts. So that, of course, it's not a matter. I remember these sort of debates in the early 2000s, about one side would say there is a global order, therefore states are no longer important. And the other side would say states are still important, therefore there's no global order. Now, obviously, the point here is to talk about the emergence of a global order in which the states play a central role, but it extends well beyond them. And I guess where I was trying to go also with this is to that question about what maybe the nature of different forms of violence the kinds of violence of this that goes beyond fascism, according to this too, like not beyond fascism in a sense of in any spatial sense, but that it poses some political formation that is in some sense more extreme than fascism that one gets with this. And which is perfectly, again, where I started with this again, when you mentioned that states and non-states, I mean, this notion of the global war machine that uses states is not a state formation. It's a smooth in their sense. It's multiple. It's all those things that one might, with casual reading, want to affirm, but is able to deploy them in a way that's much more horrible still.
Yeah, and so when you were talking about this, this quite a powerful phrase, this peace more terrifying still, and it kind of reminded me also that inversion of Clausewitz, the ways in which actually during the wars on terror, the idea of the war for hearts and minds was precisely politics as the continuation of war by other means. And I'm kind of struck in terms of how does the one of the things which I found really also compelling about yours and Tony's work was when you went into Multitude and the opening part of Multitude, when you talk about global civil war and the arrival of this kind of different, and as you say, there's a kind of a decoupling of power from the state. I say not the states are not important, but actually power still operates in the global space of flows. Now, obviously, during the war on terror, it was kind of easy to fall back into reductive understandings. This is just US hegemony and so on and so forth. And perhaps it's equally compelling today just to see the world once again as neat, realist conflicts between the US and Russia and so forth, without actually recognizing the ways in which power still operates in that global space of flows. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that idea of global civil war and that continuation of empire in the world in which we are living today?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're certainly right that there's once again, a challenge to that, an important challenge to that way of thinking by the contemporary events, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the way it can, that once again, there, at least in a temporary way, there's a kind of reactivation of national sovereignty as the grid for understanding, seemingly understanding the global framework. I do think, I mean, I'm just stubborn. I do think that, I mean, what was useful, I think, for us about that notion of a global civil war was a way of recognizing lines of conflict that weren't simply defined by states, and hence, the external war. That's the way international law has always thought about it. One sovereign power that conflicts with another sovereign power, but instead goes within and beyond. And so that we have to think the lines of conflict pose it as a challenge in more difficult terms. That's what we wanted with that notion of global civil war, and I think that's also exactly what Deleuze and Guattari were trying to get at here. When they, I mean, Tony and I fall into the same trap at sometimes, because they say, this global war machine is a smooth space. It's, of course, then they say 3 sentences later, it's of course more striated than the striation of states. And I guess I'm sorry for those listening who aren't all inside the Deleuze Guattari vocabulary. It's very hard with books like this not to at certain points fall into their language without explaining such things. But I do think, I mean, what I took, I guess, with the two concepts there, multiplicity then, and then here this global war machine, I took both of those as, not in some sense like the answer, but as trying to grapple with real political problems that we're facing, that we were facing in the 1970s, and that I think that are the political problems that still face us today. You might say that multiplicity functions on both levels, actually. On the level of the global system, that's partly what we're getting at here, and even the notion of what fascism means and what are the current forms of repression. But but also the possibilities and the possible arrangements of movements for liberation, like both of them are taking place on a terrain of multiplicity, and that's a challenge to think through. Maybe it's so rather this could sound rather unsatisfying, I suppose, to someone, which is that neither of these are really answers. They're rather posing the terrain on which we have to think and organize, or I mean that, and organize too, but to think the political problems of today, I think that's the way I take what I get mostly from A Thousand Plateaus, which is a kind of starting point, rather than a book of answers that can be then applied.
Yeah, I'm just kind of mindful of time because we've run. That's very. I feel like I could chat to you for another 2 hours, Michael. I think I guess there's 2 points which I'll kind of end on you, because I'm mindful we should open it up to some questions as well. The point that you raise about, because what I always found appreciative with Empire to me was actually to me it seemed like a necessary updating of the Treaty of Nomadology, and I really appreciated that. Now, one of the things also going back over both the books recently, it struck me actually that when you, particularly with Empire, the book seems even more resonant today in the age of big tech. And I think you were, when you were writing that book, the dominance of big tech and the languages you use in there in terms of networks, multiplicities, in terms of the operations of power, seem all the more resonant in this age of big tech dominance today. And so one thing I guess I think about, how do you think about this idea of war machines in this age of big tech? But then I guess the final question I'd like to end on, maybe a little point on, optimism, is, what's become of the multitude? And to invoke a Deleuzian concept of becoming, what do you think has become of the multitude in the contemporary moment? I know they're 2 very big questions, but maybe,
Yeah, the big tech question, I think the only thing, or at least the only thing to do quickly is just the starting point one, which is that it's the fact of that even when one recognizes the decentered nature of them, that doesn't and the network forms of control, it shouldn't mean that all network forms are repressive. It's rather, I think it should be no surprise. I mean, this is that the structures, let's say the geometries even, of movements of liberation are mimicked by or work on the same terrain as, let's say, something like that, within the same episteme, one would say in a different vocabulary, as the the forms of domination take that same form as these struggles for liberation. The specifics about big tech, that's a big question. I'm going to leave that for a second, because that would require more. When you say what has become of the multitude, I think for that, my what do you call it? My method, my instincts, is always to start with the movements and ask what we can learn from them. Like, so it's not so much, having an idea of the multitude and then like, where can we find it? What is it doing? It'd be rather, what are the most exciting and inspiring movements for liberation today, and how can we interpret their form? Which I think by necessity we have to think in terms of multiplicity and the ways of managing multiplicities. Just to take, like for instance, one of the movements I've been most excited by in recent years is Ni Una Menos in Argentina and in other countries. And, while it starts in some ways as a movement against femicide, against violence against women, and as a feminist movement more broadly around reproductive rights, etc., it's also finding ways to work also as a decolonial movement, and for indigenous rights, as a worker movement, the kind of articulation that is invoked in a movement like that, that seems to me the way I would say, like, well, maybe that's how we should understand multitude. Like start with what the movements are doing, and like I say, the articulation among relatively autonomous movements, anti-racist movements, feminist movements, class movements, that the ways that they articulate together, that might be the way of thinking the multiplicity and thinking the multitude. Anyway, that would be my method, the way I would approach it.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Michael. That's very revealing as well. And I think, I agree with you. We start with the reality and rather than trying, and I think that's Deleuze's method, right? Start with the reality and then see what theory fits, and if we can, and if we can make sense of it. So, but thanks so much. And I will now Anthony, who will read some of the questions.
Sorry, I was muted. Rookie error. Yeah, there are lots of questions coming in. Some are kind of like nuts and bolts. Some are a little bit more specific. So I think I'll start with what I call the sort of more nuts and bolts questions. So this is a question from Alice, who says, thanks for this great conversation. Is there a single overarching definition of violence that Deleuze and Guattari work with, or are there multiple and overlapping models they engage with that would resist a single definition? So any thoughts on that, Michael?
I don't think, like my tendency, but here I think, Brad, you probably see this differently. Now I'm first going to start about me and then maybe try to get Deleuze Guattari to answer it too, which is that I don't see violence really as a concept. Because I guess with one of Alice's alternatives was that I don't see it as that one can identify and rest on a notion of it, or rather, maybe I should even try to historicize it. That in a social formation like ours, we are so steeped in forms of violence that maybe it's hard to see the outside of it. That would be the way of trying to historicize my own lack of definition of it. And I do think that because Alice was really asking about Deleuze Guattari, not about me. So I think that is the way they. I don't see a. It doesn't have a consistency, I would say. And there's certainly no ethical or political standard one can stand on one side or the other for them.
Thanks, Brad. What's your sort of take on Alice's question about fundamental definition?
No, I think I agree with Michael in the sense of, there are certain concepts which use language in particularly in 1,000 Plateaus, like war machine, right, where we think, well, okay, it has a kind of a necessary violence to it. But if you read their idea of war machines, it's war machines are actually not violent in a direct kind of physical way in their understanding, although they can become violent once they're actually appropriated by the state. The thing about 1,000 Plateaus is when they do actually talk about violence, they actually refer into actual physical violence. It's very clear in the book that state violence and the violence they refer to is violence which is very real and very much so. It's not a kind of a conceptual issue, it's actually actual violence. And I think Michael's, I agree again, is that it's the violence which becomes so normalized, it becomes so woven into the everyday fabric of existence, you might not even see it as violence. And I think that's what they're opening up in 1,000 Plateaus, is for us to see the inherent violence of states and these social organizations, which create a certain kind of overcoding of the social and cultural order. And I do think in terms of, if we think about the violence in the book, there's not a single kind of narrative of violence. I think for them, violence is as mutable as fascism. Fascism takes many different forms, and so does violence. I do think the point that Michael raises is such an important question still for us, is there an outside to violence? And I think that's still the question we are grappling with today. What does that outside to violence even possibly look like? It seems like we're impossible of, we can't even imagine what that looks like, I think.
And so, Brad, in that passage I read, when they say a peace more terrifying still, in some ways it seemed like when you were, part of what you were just saying is that that maybe we can't even recognize the outside you know, that what is sold to us as a piece, or, you know, is presented to us as the lack of violence is itself a kind of horrifying repression. I don't know what else to say about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it also connects to your point, Michael, about, you know, not only what kind of multiplicity, but what kind of piece are we talking about, right? And I think you know, sometimes the most violent societies are remarkably peaceful, you know, and I think that is in itself very revealing of the inherent violence to it. So.
Thank you. So we'll go on to another one that I consider to be a sort of nuts and bolts style question. So this from Andres, who says, in the event blurb, it discusses the spatial dimension of violence. At which level or levels does this idea of spatial violence operate in A Thousand Plateaus? Presumably it is not just referring to the global space within which state violence operates. Thank you. Michael?
I'm not sure I understand, Anthony. Is it that, like, for instance, I pointed to that passage toward the end of the book where it is talking about this global war machine, and in that question, it is us thinking about space at a very large term. But that other points in the book, is this maybe Andres's point there, that they thinking about violence that have very different spatial register or different scale? Is that?
Yeah, so this may be Brad putting you in a tricky situation, because he wrote the blurb in which I think this is what Andres is picking up. It says, a marked impact on how we understand the spatial and temporal dimensions of violence. So I think Andres was picking up on specifically that idea of the spatial dimension of violence and sort of the scope of that particular idea. If that clarifies, I don't know if it does.
It does. I think it would be helpful, and it's probably right, to give, you know, instances where they're thinking about, maybe this would be the place, you know, when in an earlier chapter when they're talking about microfascisms or about fascisms that are, you know, within movements of liberation themselves, or that sort of thing, that could be maybe of thinking about a different scale on which the violence is taking place, so that there's, maybe a kind of homology among the different scalar dimensions. But I still feel like I'm not answering that very well.
Well, should we hand it to Brad, who may have his own take on the question? I mean, it could just be one of those questions which, me not having read Deleuze and Guattari, it doesn't actually kind of capture what I think Andres thinks it may be trying to capture.
I'm going to try to, you know, point people maybe into the direction of Michael's work here, because I think the you know, and especially for those who don't know, you know, for Deleuze and Guattari's work, and especially A Thousand Plateaus, you know, if you engage with nomadology, you can kind of first of all read this particular chapter as it's almost like a revolutionary struggle, what Michael talked about, you know, the smooth versus the striated space, right? The open space of liberation versus the capturing segmentary space of the states and the drawing of borders and boundaries. But I think Deleuze already anticipated that model was breaking apart with his essay on control societies, and the way in which that old kind of state dominant structure of borders against the kind of internal revolutionary movements was shifting. And that's the one thing which I think, you know, Michael and Tony did great with Empire, was to show how power itself was also becoming nomadic and kind of open to this smooth open space as well. But I think what we've also learned now, and we can see this especially in this age of digitalization, the more seemingly globalized we become, the more segmented we are. And I think that's all there in Deleuze, that, you know, the open space and the closed space are not necessarily strategically opposite. They can work in alignment with one another. So what looks like a contradiction is not a contradiction at all in terms of the operations of power. And I think that, you know, and I would certainly point the people who are listening to Michael and Tony's book, Empire, on that, because I think it really deals with that in a very rigorous way. So.
Anthony, I think you're muted again.
Yes, I pressed it, but it didn't unmute me. It's just one of those things. So I'm going to turn to Naomi's question. So Naomi asks, entering these discussions via decolonial discourses of pluriversality seems to be grounded in a way that the discussion of terrain in Deleuze and Guattari doesn't seem to be. So how or where does this talk of terrain actually touch ground? And then Naomi says, starting from actual liberatory movement sounds just right, but what do Deleuze and Guattari add to our understanding in this context?
Can you go back, Anthony, to the very beginning of the question about the pluriverse, about pluriversality? Can you
Sure.
just read
So
the
as
first
I
clause?
understand Naomi, I'm guessing that maybe with the idea of multiplicity, that could bring to mind this idea of pluriversality. And she's linking that in particular to ideas related to decolonization. And she seems to be saying that this idea of pluriversality is grounded in a particular way. And I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think it may even be related to this idea of earthiness or materiality. And so she's asking, where does the talk of terrain, which I think she links with Deleuze and Guattari, actually touch ground, or perhaps relate to materiality?
I mean, I'm not sure. When Naomi asked what did Deleuze and Guattari add to it, I'm not sure if I can answer that part. I mean, it might be that you find more elsewhere, but I think you're absolutely right, or this is the part that seems most useful to me, is to recognize a coherent project between decolonial thought and notions of pluriversality and the kinds of instincts that Deleuze and Guattari have around multiplicity, and that these are, I would say, even if not directly communicating, they're working parallel paths, maybe put it that way. So, I mean, I would go back and forth between them. I mean, for many people, I think there was a period when the Zapatistas and the rhetoric of Subcomandante Marcos had a kind of point of exchange that allowed for these sorts of things. Like, remember the Zapatista slogan, like, that we want, queremos un mundo en donde quepan muchos mundos, like a world in which many worlds fit, which I don't know, seemed to me one of these points of contact between the proposals of liberatory multiplicity in Deleuze Guattari and a notion of a decolonial pluriverse or something like that. So anyway, I think that's exactly the right place to be thinking. And you know, the way it often works for me with these kinds of theoretical texts, you know, if this one works for you, that's great. And if it doesn't work for you, put that one down and go to the other one. So it could be that you could work with whichever one is you know, like, rather than saying that Deleuze and Guattari give a necessary and unique perspective, it could be that you could get it many different places. And okay, I sort of stop.
That's great. Thanks, Michael. Brad, do you have anything to add to Naomi's question or to Michael's response?
Yeah, well, I guess just in terms of just trying to stick with the Thousand Plateaus first, I think that is, you know, I think the book is actually loaded with the decolonial sensitivity. And I think in terms of when they actually drawing out examples for nomadology, I think there's a lot of broad references outside of a kind of a European ideal of, you know, politics. And also the one chapter that, you know, Michael mentioned earlier about this idea of the one, what is the universal, the standard through which, you know, we're always setting this dialectic against. In the chapter on faciality, they are constantly trying to break down the idea of whiteness and the white face. And so it's very clear in their critique that they are deeply concerned with that model and that standard. So I think it's woven into the narrative as a kind of decolonial text. And I agree. I was actually, before Michael mentioned the Zapatistas, I was thinking of the Zapatistas precisely in this kind of idea and the generative concept of the pluriverse, because I think what the Zapatistas question precisely was how can we construct an ethics of difference? And the writings of Marcos was all about difference. What can difference look like? How can we think difference? And difference in itself then, as difference is not the cause of violence, but homogenization is the cause of violence. And difference might just be the way through which we might be able to find an escape from violence. And I think that's where perhaps Deleuze also has a non-violent politics through not seeing, differences as the source of violence, but actually the opposite. Differences allow for non-violence to even be considered.